Hi there. Imagine this. It is Saturday, just a week before your exam. You wake up early to study for the exam, but then you realize that it was still a week away and you aren't really feeling motivated. So you decide to take the day off instead. So you wake up early again this time, then you realize that it was the weekend and you still have 6 days before the exam. So you instead decide to play your favorite game. So this went on and on until. So during the exam day, and so the results. All because you lacked motivation. But what exactly is motivation? Well, motivation refers to the desire and the force that drives us to do a certain thing or action. So high motivation equals easier work, while motivation equals harder and more challenging work. To understand how this works, we need to talk about dopamine. Dopamine is a hormone in our body that is known as the feel good hormone. We usually associate this with pleasure, but it is actually more than that. We should actually think of dopamine more as a driving force for our cravings for certain things. In other words, dopamine is responsible for our motivation. So you might think that to be motivated, all we need to do is increase that dopamine, right? Well, not so fast. To understand why, let's talk about the pain-pleasure balance. That is, given this graph out here of dopamine levels with respect to time, take note that if there is a sudden increase in dopamine, we will have a peak, but along with that is an equivalent decrease which results to a crash. Afterwards, dopamine levels will go back up until it reaches the baseline levels of dopamine. So, for every high peak in dopamine, there is a deep crash associated with it. For example, if you eat a chocolate that tastes so good, afterward, you'll want more of it, right? And if you don't get it, there is a pain or dissatisfaction that you'll feel afterwards. Aside from that, this portion out here is where the lack of motivation occurs. So now you know that whenever you feel unmotivated, it probably is a result of an activity or activities that you did prior to that feeling. Now, a consequence of this is procrastination. So, procrastination is the act of delaying a challenging task by doing mini tasks that are less painful. What do I mean by that? In our story a while ago, the 1 week preparation became 1 day instead because you chose to delay the study by playing your favorite game instead. With these things in mind, question is, how do we fix this? Well, we'll be going over several tools to fix this. But first, let us understand the principles behind these tools. First, we aim to increase the baseline level of dopamine instead of the peaks. That is, we'll be learning tools that could increase our levels of dopamine and actually sustain it for long periods of time. Second, we aim to avoid unnecessary peaks and just maintain a moderate and healthy level. In that way, we can ensure that we can avoid crashes and the feeling of unmotivated. Lastly, we'll try to do the opposite. Start with the pain first, going to the pleasure. So now here are the tools to increase our motivation. First is the fundamentals. These are the things that must be done every day to ensure a high and healthy baseline level of dopamine. These are sleep, nutrition, sunlight, and exercise. Let's go over these one by one. For sleep, you need to ensure that you sleep at around 6 to 8 hours every day. During sleep, your dopamine reserves are restored, making sure that you have the right amount of dopamine to deal with the challenges of the day. If your sleep isn't ideal, a remedy that you can use is non-sleep deep rest or NSDR. According to Dr. Andrew Huberman, in just 10 to 30 minutes of NSDR, you could experience sleep-like quality benefits after it. I'll put a link of the 10-minute NSDR by Dr. Andrew Huberman down below. For nutrition, make sure to include L-tyrosine in your diet. This is an amino acid that helps in the production of dopamine. Foods such as chicken, fish, peanuts, bananas, milk, cheese, and yogurt are known to contain high levels of this amino acid. Next, we have morning sunlight or light in general. Viewing sunlight early in the day is beneficial for our levels of baseline dopamine. The guidelines are as follows. On a clear day, view sunlight for a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes. On a cloudy day, view sunlight for a minimum of 10 to 20 minutes. On a very cloudy or overcast day, view sunlight for a minimum of 20 to 30 minutes. Aside from this, make sure to also avoid viewing light from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. as it can reduce our capacity to get dopamine for several days after light exposure. If you can't avoid this, you can use blue light blockers such as Flux, which I would put a link down below. Lastly, we have exercise. This can be any form of movement such as resistance or cardiovascular training. The minimum days that Dr. Andrew Huberman suggests is 5 days a week, but if you can, then exercise every day. So these are the fundamentals that you first need to cover before even trying out other tools to increase your motivation. We now move on to the second one, which is cold exposure. Cold exposure, such as ice bath, is known to increase the baseline level of dopamine of up to 250%, which is remarkably high. Aside from that, this increase lasts for around 2 to 6 hours, which is again pretty remarkable. This happens because again, the amount of pain that you experience is equal to the amount of pleasure that you gain. For most people, an ice bath is extremely challenging and painful task, making this result to an increase in motivation afterwards. Ideally, this should be done in the morning so that you can make the most out of its benefits throughout the day. Next on our list is meditation and daily caffeine. Meditation is the practice of mindfulness that increases our focus, calmness, and awareness. Along with these wonderful benefits, meditation also helps in dealing with procrastination. Like the cold exposure, meditation is a challenging task for most people. Incorporating 5 to 10 minutes of focused breathing whenever you feel a lack of motivation can quickly spike up your levels of dopamine. So whenever you feel the urge to play your favorite game, try doing meditation instead. Now let's go on to caffeine. Caffeine can also slightly increase our levels of dopamine. But more than that, regular ingestion of caffeine has a protective effect on our dopamine neurons. This means that caffeine makes you experience more dopamine effects in the long run. So, whenever you feel motivated, you'll really experience this feeling of motivation. Just make sure to drink this one in the morning so that your sleep won't be affected later on. Next, our fifth tool would be high cadence music. Music also plays a role in our levels of motivation. Particularly, high cadence music or music that is around 140 to 150 beats per minute makes us more motivated regardless if we know the song or the lyrics of the song. I'll put some Spotify links below of 140 to 150 beats per minute music that you can check later on. Take note that you should do this 10 to 15 minutes prior to studying and not during the study. As a side note, during your study, you should try to listen to 40 Hz binaural beats, white noise or brown noise, as it is known to be beneficial in your focus. You can easily check these out on YouTube, and if these aren't accessible, silence is the best alternative. Just a last tip, keeping the playlist mixed also helps our dopamine levels because variety and surprises are something that our dopamine loves. 6 on our list is dopamine detox. Dopamine detox is a process that involves fasting from instant gratifications or activities that result in quick dopamine releases such as sugar, video games, etc. Examples of these are intermittent fasting, quitting sugar, quitting social media, and such. This is useful since it replenishes our dopamine reserves. In other words, it returns the amount of dopamine in our body to a healthy level. By temporarily depriving ourselves of these instant gratifications, we become more hungry and driven, making us more motivated to deal with tasks on hand. Just take note that this usually lasts for around 30 days. So you might want to try cutting that video game habit of yours for 30 days. I know it's hard, but you can do it. I believe in you. Second to the last tool would be celebrating small wins but not intensely. We all know that we should celebrate our wins no matter how small that is. However, it is recommended that these celebrations shouldn't be intense. Recall from earlier that a big peak in dopamine results in a big crash afterwards. So if you binge on your favorite game after an exam, what you'll find is that you'll feel very unmotivated for a day or two. We don't want that. So make sure to not celebrate intensely and just keep on moving forward. Last but certainly not the least would be intrinsic motivation. We start by discussing the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcement. Intrinsic reinforcement occurs when the activity that we do is the reward itself. On the other hand, extrinsic reinforcement occurs when the reward happens after or happened before the activity. For instance, if you are studying, you'll have 2 types of reasons why you enjoy it. One is intrinsic, or you enjoy the act of studying itself. And the other is extrinsic, such as listening to your favorite music while studying or anticipating your favorite game after you study. Between these two, it was found that intrinsic reinforcement is much better in the long run, since in extrinsic reinforcement, we tend to associate the reward outside the activity, making the actual activity less enticing over a long period of time. So how do we do this? The key is to find the joy in the pursuit, treat the challenge of the activity as the reward, and it is all about having a growth mindset, making the pain pleasurable. According to Dr. Andrew Huberman, tell your brain that the effort part is the good part. This is very painful, and because it is painful, it will invoke an increase in dopamine later. You are doing it by choice and because you love it. Don't spike dopamine before and after effort. Learn to spike dopamine from effort itself. Now that you have some tools on how to be more motivated and avoid procrastination, next question would be, how do we actually apply this? My advice is that you should start by implementing only one of these tools first. Gradual changes are still better in the long run compared to drastic changes. I also suggest that you start with the fundamentals, as these are the basics that shouldn't be avoided, not only for dopamine but also for your health in general. So, if we go back to our scenario earlier, so you wake up early a week before your exam to study for it, and despite the lack of motivation, this time you instantly implemented one of the tools that was mentioned earlier. This led to an increased motivation, helping you study for the exam, and ultimately leading to a high or even perfect score, making your parents proud, and most of all, making yourself